For almost 150 years, one family sat on the Dragon Throne of Vietnam. They were called the Sons of Heaven. Their capital at Huế was a city within a city within a city, an imperial citadel guarding a forbidden purple city, a place so sacred that an ordinary Vietnamese could be executed simply for looking at the emperor's face. 13 emperors of the House of Nguyễn ruled from that throne. They had unified a country that had been torn apart by centuries of civil war. They commanded mandarins and armies, controlled the rice and the rivers, and claimed a mandate that came not from any parliament or any people, but from heaven itself. To their subjects, the emperor was not quite a man. He was the link between the earthly world and the divine. And then, in the space of a single afternoon, it was all gone. Not in a great battle, not in a massacre. It ended with a quiet handover of a golden seal and an ancient sword at a palace gate in front of a silent crowd. The last Son of Heaven stepped down from a throne his ancestors had held for over a century, took off the imperial robes, and declared that he would rather be an ordinary citizen of a free country than the emperor of a captive one. That was the dignified version. What came after was not. Within a decade, the man who had been worshipped as a living link to heaven was known across Europe by a very different title, the Playboy Emperor. A figure of tabloid gossip, gambling away borrowed fortunes in the casinos of the French Riviera, while his homeland tore itself apart in a war that would kill millions. Within 50 years, he would die in a military hospital in Paris, nearly broke, largely forgotten, his once legendary fortune reduced almost to nothing, buried beneath one of the simplest headstones you can imagine. A wife would die alone in the French countryside. A crown prince would spend his final years locked in a bitter feud with his own family over a sword and a seal. And the golden imperial seal itself, the very object handed over that afternoon in 1945, would vanish, resurface in a Paris auction house nearly 80 years later, and set off an international scramble to bring it home. This is one of the strangest and most poignant falls of any royal family in the modern world. A dynasty that didn't just lose its empire, but was slowly, deliberately dismantled over 60 years by one of the most powerful colonial machines on Earth. And outside of Vietnam, almost nobody knows the full story. So let me take you through it, the complete story of what happened to Vietnam's royal family after their empire fell. Because the details are far stranger, far more tragic, and far more human than you might expect. To understand how the last emperor ended up broke in Paris, you first have to understand something crucial. The Nguyễn dynasty did not fall all at once in 1945. By the time the last emperor gave up his throne, the family had already been dying for more than 60 years, humiliated, deposed, and exiled one emperor at a time. The Dragon Throne wasn't toppled in a single revolution. It was hollowed out slowly from the inside until there was almost nothing left to fall. And that long, agonizing decline had a single cause: France. The House of Nguyễn came to power in 1802 when a determined warlord named Nguyễn An finally defeated his rivals, unified the whole of Vietnam from the northern mountains to the southern deltas, and crowned himself the Emperor Gia Long. For the first time in generations, Vietnam was one country under one throne, ruled from a magnificent new capital at Huế, built in deliberate imitation of the imperial cities of China. His successors expanded the citadel, filled the court with elaborate ritual, and governed a proud, ancient, deeply Confucian society. But even at its height, a shadow was falling across the empire. Out on the horizon were European warships. By the mid-1800s, France had decided it wanted an empire in Asia, and Vietnam was the prize. The excuse was the protection of Catholic missionaries. The real motive was ports, resources, and a doorway into southern China. In 1858, French forces attacked, and over the next 30 years, piece by piece, France ate the empire alive. First, they seized the south, the rich rice-growing region around Saigon, and turned it into a direct French colony called Cochinchina. Then, in the 1880s, they forced treaties on the emperor that reduced the rest of the country, the central region of Annam and the northern region of Tonkin, to French protectorates. On paper, the emperor still ruled. In reality, a French official called a resident now sat in Huế, and nothing could happen without his approval. The Son of Heaven had become a signature on French paperwork. And here is where the story of the royal family becomes a story of resistance and punishment, because not every emperor was willing to be a puppet. Consider the boy emperor Ham Nhi. He came to the throne in 1884 at just 13 years old, at the very moment France was tightening its grip. But this teenager refused to play the role of a compliant figurehead. In 1885, his advisors smuggled him out of the palace in the dead of night, and from the mountains, he issued a royal proclamation calling on the entire country to rise up and drive out the French. It was called the Convoying Movement, Aid the King. For 3 years, a 13, then 14, then 15-year-old emperor lived as a fugitive in the jungle, the living symbol of a national uprising, while the French hunted him relentlessly. They finally caught him in 1888, betrayed, as these things often are, by someone close to him. And the French did something that would become a grim pattern for this dynasty. They did not kill him. Killing an emperor makes a martyr. Instead, they made him disappear. They put the young man on a ship and exiled him thousands of miles away to French Algeria, in North Africa, a place he had never seen, whose language he did not speak, surrounded by a culture entirely foreign to him. And what happened to that exiled boy emperor is genuinely one of the most unexpected turns in this whole story. In Algiers, cut off forever from his homeland, Hamdi did not waste away. He learned French, he discovered art, he trained as a painter and a sculptor, studying under respected French artists, and became a genuinely accomplished one, exhibiting his work, developing a real reputation in European artistic circles. He married a French woman, the daughter of a colonial magistrate. He raised children who were half Vietnamese, half French, growing up as Algerians. He lived nearly 60 years in that exile and died in 1944 without ever setting foot in Vietnam again. A former son of heaven who ended his days as a painter on the North African coast, buried in French soil. He was the first emperor the French made vanish. He would not be the last. His replacement, an emperor named Thanh Thai, lasted longer, nearly 2 decades. But he too began to chafe against French control. He grew erratic, unpredictable, openly contemptuous of the officials who managed him. Some said he was going mad. Others believed the madness was at least partly an act, a way to resist a role he despised. The French didn't much care about the distinction. In 1907, they declared him mentally unfit and deposed him. In his place, they put his own son on the throne, a 7-year-old boy who took the name Duitan. The French assumed a child would be easy to control. They could not have been more wrong. Duitan grew into a serious, intense, patriotic young man who despised the gilded cage he had been placed in. And in 1916, as a teenager, he did the unthinkable. He slipped out of the palace to lead an armed uprising against the French, timed to coincide with the chaos of the First World War. The plot was betrayed almost immediately. The rebellion collapsed within days, and the French, faced with a second rebel emperor from the same bloodline, reached for the same solution they always did. They exiled him. Father and son, the deposed Thanh Thai and the rebel Duitan, were both shipped off together to the remote island of Réunion in the middle of the Indian Ocean to live out their days in obscurity. And Duitan's story has perhaps the most haunting ending of all. During the Second World War, this exiled emperor joined the Free French forces under Charles de Gaulle. He fought for the country that had stolen his throne, rose through the ranks to become a respected officer, and by 1945 there was serious talk, even from de Gaulle himself, of restoring him to the Vietnamese throne as a modern, pro-French monarch. It might have changed the entire course of Vietnamese history, but we will never know. In December of 1945, the plane carrying Duitan crashed in Central Africa, killing him instantly, just as his impossible second chance was within reach. 3 emperors, 3 men who tried to be more than puppets, and 3 exiles, Algeria, Réunion, and finally a plane wreck in the African jungle. By the 1920s, the pattern was unmistakable. The French would tolerate a son of heaven only for exactly as long as he stayed silent, obedient, and ornamental. Which brings us, at last, to the man at the center of this story, the final emperor. The one who would preside over the end of everything. His name was Bảo Đại. Bảo Đại was born in 1913, and from the very beginning, the French intended to raise a different kind of emperor, not a rebel like his predecessors, but a product of France itself. When he was still a child, they sent him thousands of miles from Hue to be educated in Paris. He grew up not among mandarins and court rituals, but in French schools, speaking French as easily as Vietnamese, wearing Western suits, driving fast cars, playing tennis, developing a lifelong taste for hunting, gambling, and the glamorous life of the European elite. When his father died in 1925, Bảo Đại technically became emperor at the age of 12, but he was sent straight back to France to finish his education, while regents ran the country in his name. he didn't return to sit on his own throne until 1932, a 19-year-old who was, in many ways, more French than Vietnamese. And for a brief moment, it looked like he might actually change things. The young emperor came home full of reformist energy. He talked about modernizing the government, cleaning up the corrupt court, giving Vietnam a genuine constitutional monarchy. He brought in ambitious young officials, including a devout, austere Catholic named Ngo Dinh Diem, a name to remember because he will return to this story in the most devastating way possible. But the reforms went nowhere. The French had no intention of letting a real reformer loosen their grip, and Bảo Đại, for all his talk, lacked the ruthless will of a Ham Ninh or a Duy-Tân. When the French blocked his plans, he didn't fight to the death or flee to the mountains. He shrugged, retreated to his palaces, and turned to what he genuinely loved: hunting big game in the highlands, vacationing on the coast, and enjoying the comforts of being a wealthy figurehead. The reformer quietly became the ornament the French had always wanted. He did do one thing that broke centuries of tradition, and it's worth pausing on, because it's genuinely touching. In 1934, Bảo Đại married a woman named Nguyen Hu Thi Lan, a stunningly beautiful, French-educated Catholic from one of the wealthiest families in the South. He made her his empress, gave her the name Nam Phuong, meaning fragrance of the South, and then did something no Vietnamese emperor had ever done. He publicly promised to take no other wives. In a dynasty built on harems and concubines, the last emperor promised monogamy to a woman he seemed genuinely to love. It was romantic. It was modern, and as we'll see, it was a promise he would not keep, a broken vow that would quietly poison his family for the rest of their lives. For a while, though, they were the golden couple of a doomed empire, a handsome cosmopolitan emperor and his beautiful, gracious empress, raising 5 children in the palaces of Huế, presiding over ceremonies whose ancient power had already drained away. They were, in truth, actors playing emperor and empress on a stage the French controlled completely. And then the world caught fire. When the Second World War broke out, Vietnam became a trap with no exit. France fell to Nazi Germany in 1940, and the French colonial government in Vietnam, now loyal to the collaborationist Vichy regime, cut a deal with Imperial Japan. Japanese troops occupied Vietnam, but for most of the war they left the French administrators in place to run things on their behalf. So Vietnam endured a bizarre and brutal double occupation. French officials taking orders from Japanese generals, both of them squeezing the Vietnamese people. Bảo Đại remained on his throne through all of it, a figurehead now serving 2 masters instead of 1. Then, in March of 1945, with Japan losing the war and no longer trusting the French, the Japanese struck. In a single swift coup, they overthrew the French colonial government entirely, imprisoning the officials who had ruled Vietnam for 60 years. And suddenly, Bảo Đại was offered something no Nguyen emperor had held in over half a century: independence. It was, of course, a lie. The independence Japan offered was independence as a Japanese puppet, with Japan now pulling the strings the French had held before. But Bảo Đại took it. He declared the French protectorate treaties void, proclaimed the Empire of Vietnam, and appointed a Vietnamese government. For a few strange months in 1945, the last emperor ruled a nominally independent Vietnam, even as the country plunged into one of the worst catastrophes in its history: a devastating famine in the north caused by the war, wartime policies, and hoarding that killed somewhere between several 100,000 and 2 million people. Bảo Dai's brief empire presided over mass starvation. And in the shadows, a very different Vietnamese movement was growing, disciplined, organized, and utterly determined. The Viet Minh, a communist-led independence front under a revolutionary named Ho Chi Minh, had spent the war building a network across the country. When Japan surrendered to the Allies in August 1945, a sudden vacuum of power opened up. The French were imprisoned, the Japanese were defeated, and the Viet Minh moved with breathtaking speed to seize control in what became known as the August Revolution. Within days, Viet Minh supporters were pouring into the streets of every major city. Red flags with a gold star appeared everywhere, and it became clear, very quickly, that the age of emperors was over, that the vast majority of politically active Vietnamese now wanted a republic, an independence movement, a future with no dragon throne in it at all. Bảo Đại understood the moment better than his ancestors might have. He knew he had no army loyal to him, no real base of support, and no French masters left to prop him up. And so, On August 30th, 1945, in front of a huge crowd gathered at the Nguyen Gate of the imperial city, the last son of heaven of Vietnam abdicated his throne. He handed the symbols of 143 years of Nguyen rule, the golden imperial seal, and the imperial sword to the representatives of Ho Chi Minh's new government, and he spoke a line that has echoed through Vietnamese history ever since. He said he would rather be a citizen of an independent country than the emperor of an enslaved one. It was a genuinely graceful exit. In a single afternoon, a dynasty that stretched back to 1802, a throne that claimed the mandate of heaven itself, simply ceased to exist. The emperor took off his robes, put on an ordinary Western suit, and walked out of the imperial city, a private man for the first time in his life. He even took a new name, Citizen Vinh Thuy, and, in a startling twist, briefly served as a supreme advisor to Ho Chi Minh's revolutionary government in Hanoi. The Son of Heaven had become a consultant to the men who abolished his throne, but that strange arrangement could not last. And this is where the fall of Vietnam's royal family stops being a clean, dignified story of abdication and becomes something messier, sadder, and far more revealing about what actually happens to fallen royalty in the modern world, because Bao Jai's story was only half over. In 1946, tensions between the Viet Minh and the returning French exploded into open war, the First Indochina War, a brutal conflict that would rage for 8 years. And Bao Jai, the ex-emperor turned revolutionary advisor, saw which way the wind was blowing and slipped out of the country, drifting first to China and then to Hong Kong. There, freed from every role he had ever been forced to play, he did exactly what he had always privately wanted to do. He became a man of leisure, and then, incredibly, they brought him back. By 1949, the French were losing their war against the communists, and they were desperate for a Vietnamese face to put on their cause. A non-communist alternative to Ho Chi Minh who could give their puppet state a shred of legitimacy, and who better than a former emperor? So the French coaxed Bao Jai out of his comfortable exile and installed him as head of state of a new entity called the State of Vietnam. He wasn't emperor anymore, the throne was gone, but he was once again a figurehead controlled by France. He had come full circle. He had spent his youth as a French puppet emperor, abdicated to become a citizen, briefly advised the communists, and now returned as a French puppet president. And by this point, he barely bothered to hide his disinterest. He spent enormous stretches of his reign not in Vietnam at all, but in France, at his villas, at his hunting lodges, and most famously, at the casinos and clubs of the French Riviera. The international press gave him the nickname that would define him forever, the Playboy Emperor. Stories circulated of his gambling, his affairs, his fast cars, and his beautiful companions, all while the country he supposedly led bled in a savage colonial war. It was, frankly, an undignified spectacle. But it also set up his final, brutal fall, and it came at the hands of the very man he had once mentored. Remember Ngo Dinh Diem, the austere Catholic official Bao Jai had promoted back in the 1930s? By the mid-1950s, Diem had become the prime minister of the state of Vietnam, and he had ambitions that left no room for a gambling ex-emperor. In 1955, with quiet American backing, Diem organized a referendum asking the people of the South to choose between the absent, discredited Bao Jai and himself. The result was a farce. Diem officially won with a laughably impossible 98% of the vote, with some districts reporting more votes than they had voters. But the outcome was final. Bao Jai was deposed, this time for good. The state of Vietnam became the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the last emperor of the Nguyen dynasty was formally, permanently locked out of his own country's future. He was 42 years old, and he would live for another 42 years, every single one of them in exile in France. He would never see Vietnam again. And here the story splinters, because the fall of the royal family was never just the fall of one man. It was the scattering of an entire family across the world, and their fates were even sadder than his. Consider the Empress Nam Phương. The beautiful, dignified woman who had married Bao Jai on the promise of monogamy had spent years watching that promise dissolve into a very public parade of mistresses. She was too proud to fight publicly, too devout to accept humiliation quietly. In the late 1940s, she left him behind and moved with their children to France, not to Paris, but to a quiet country estate in a small village called Chabrignac in rural France, far from the casinos and the tabloids. There, the last Empress of Vietnam lived out her days in near total obscurity, a woman who had been worshipped as the fragrance of the South, raising her children in the French countryside, increasingly alone, largely abandoned by the husband who had promised to take no other wife. In 1963, she died of a heart attack at just 49 years old. Accounts suggest she died with almost no one from her family present. She was buried in the local village cemetery in Chabrignac, a former empress of a vanished throne, resting under a modest stone in the French countryside, thousands of miles from the imperial tombs of Huế, where empresses were meant to lie. Then there were the children, the 5 children of the golden couple, princes, and a crown prince raised for a throne that evaporated beneath them. The most tragic of these was the eldest son, the crown prince Bảo Long. He had been born in 1936 as the heir to the Dragon Throne, groomed from birth to one day rule Vietnam. Instead, the empire collapsed when he was 9, and he grew up in exile in France. Like so many displaced princes in this era, he found a home in the one institution that would take a man of his background, the military. He attended the elite French military academy, became an officer, and, in a strange echo of his exiled relatives, served France in combat, fighting in the brutal Algerian War in the 1950s and 60s. Afterward, he built an ordinary professional life as a banker in Europe. But Bảo Long's story is defined by one long, bitter tragedy: his relationship with his own father. Over the decades, father and son became estranged, and their feud crystallized around a set of objects: the surviving imperial regalia, including the sword and the seals that symbolize the family's claim. Bảo Đại, chronically short of money in his later years, was accused of selling off or trying to sell royal heirlooms. Bảo Long fought to preserve them as the sacred patrimony of the dynasty. They ended up in legal disputes over the family's remaining treasures, the heir and the last emperor, suing each other over the scraps of a lost empire. Bảo Long never reigned, never married, and died in France in 2007, the crown prince of a throne that no longer existed, having spent his life guarding relics of a kingdom he was never allowed to rule. The other children scattered into ordinary European lives, some in France, some further afield, most deliberately avoiding the spotlight, quietly shedding the impossible weight of a name that had once meant Son of Heaven. A few of Bảo Dai's descendants, including children from his later relationships, eventually settled as far away as the United States, living quiet, middle-class lives in places like California. Their imperial ancestry, little more than a remarkable footnote in family conversation. And what of Bảo Dai himself, the man at the center of it all? His long exile was a slow, steady decline. The fortune everyone assumed he possessed dwindled year after year, spent, gambled, mismanaged, and eroded by a lifestyle he could no longer afford. He married again, more than once, drifting between relationships and homes. He grew older, quieter, and poorer, a curiosity from a vanished age, living in modest apartments in Paris, occasionally sought out by journalists and historians who wanted to hear about the empire that no longer existed. In his final years, in a genuinely surprising turn for a former son of heaven raised in a Confucian and Buddhist court, he converted to Catholicism and was baptized with a Christian name. On July 31st, 1997, Bảo Đại, the 13th and last emperor of the Nguyen dynasty, the last man to sit on the Dragon Throne of Vietnam, died in a military hospital in Paris. He was 83 years old. He had outlived his own empire by more than 50 years. He had seen his country occupied by the French, then the Japanese, then divided in two, then torn apart in a war that killed millions, then reunified under the very communist movement he had once handed his throne to. And through all of it, he had watched from a French exile he would never leave. He was buried in the Passy Cemetery in Paris, under a plain black headstone, no dragon, no imperial titles carved in gold, just a name and some dates. A man who had been born as a link between heaven and earth, worshipped by millions, ended beneath one of the humblest markers in a Parisian graveyard. For decades, that seemed to be the end of it. A dynasty scattered, faded, and largely forgotten, its members living ordinary lives in France and America, its emperors resting in foreign soil. But history had one more astonishing chapter in store, and it centered on that golden seal handed over at the palace gate back in 1945. The imperial seal of the Nguyen dynasty, a heavy, solid gold object cast in the 1820s, topped with a dragon, used by the emperors to stamp their most important decrees, is not just a piece of metal. It is arguably the single most important physical symbol of Vietnamese imperial sovereignty that still exists. And after the chaos of 1945 and the wars that followed, this priceless national treasure disappeared into the private hands of the exiled royal family, carried out of the country and scattered with everything else. For nearly 80 years, its whereabouts were murky, and then, in 2022, it suddenly reappeared, listed for sale at an auction house in Paris, with an estimated value of millions of euros, about to be sold to the highest anonymous bidder anywhere in the world. In Vietnam, the news landed like a thunderclap. The idea that the golden seal of their emperors, a foundational symbol of the nation itself, might vanish forever into some private collector's vault triggered a frantic, high-stakes effort. The Vietnamese government, museums, and private benefactors scrambled to stop the sale and bring the seal home. There were tense negotiations, legal maneuvering, and a race against the clock. And remarkably, it worked. After months of effort, an agreement was reached, the auction was halted, and in a carefully arranged handover, the golden imperial seal of the Nguyen dynasty was finally returned to Vietnam, coming home nearly 80 years after the last emperor gave it away, to be preserved as a national treasure in the country its emperors once ruled. It was a strange and moving epilogue. The emperors themselves could never go home. Ham Nhi died in Algeria. Duy Tun died in an African plane crash. Nam Phương died in a French village. Bảo Đại died in a Paris hospital. Bảo Long died in France guarding relics of a throne that no longer existed. Not one of the great figures of this story was ever laid to rest in the imperial city of Huế. But the golden seal, the object that symbolized everything they had lost, made the journey they never could. It came back. Now let me put all of this in a wider context. Because the fall of Vietnam's royal family wasn't just a family tragedy, it sat at the very center of one of the 20th century's most consequential struggles. And it helps explain the entire arc of modern Vietnamese history. Think about what the collapse of the Nguyen throne actually cleared the way for. When Bảo Đại abdicated in 1945 and later failed as a French figurehead, the throne didn't pass to another royal claimant. It simply vanished, and into that vacuum stepped two rival visions of Vietnam's future. On one side, Ho Chi Minh's communist-led independence movement, which had taken the emperor's seal at the palace gate. On the other, a series of anti-communist governments in the south, beginning with the very man who deposed Bảo Đại, Ngo Dinh Diem. The old monarchy, which for all its faults had been a unifying national symbol for nearly a century and a half, was gone, and there was nothing left to hold the competing visions together. What followed was one of the defining catastrophes of the modern era. The First Indochina War against the French ended in 1954 with the country split in two, a communist north and an anti-communist south, a division that then metastasized into the Vietnam War, drawing in the United States, killing millions of Vietnamese and tens of thousands of foreign soldiers, and only ending in 1975 with the fall of Saigon and the reunification of Vietnam under the communist government. And Ngo Dinh Diem, the man who had ended the monarchy? He ruled South Vietnam for less than a decade before being overthrown and assassinated in a 1963 coup, his own violent fall echoing in miniature the collapse of the dynasty he had replaced. The Dragon Throne, in other words, didn't just fall. Its absence helped shape the fault line that Vietnam would fight and bleed over for the next 30 years. And there's a deeper irony still. Modern Vietnam, the reunified socialist republic, spent decades treating the imperial past the way many revolutionary states treat the old regime, as something backward, feudal, a symbol of the corruption and weakness that had let foreigners colonize the country in the first place. But in recent decades, that has softened. The imperial city of Huế, badly damaged in the wars, has been painstakingly restored and is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a source of enormous national pride, drawing visitors from around the world. Nguyen-era art, architecture, and history are studied and celebrated. And the return of that golden seal was treated not as the recovery of some embarrassing colonial relic, but as the homecoming of a genuine national treasure. The dynasty that revolutionary Vietnam once dismissed has been quietly rehabilitated as part of the country's heritage, even as its actual descendants remain scattered abroad, ordinary citizens of other nations, with no throne, no claim, and no path home to any kind of power. There is something deeply human about this story that goes beyond politics and history. It is a story about a family raised to believe they were the link between heaven and earth, and then watching, generation after generation, as that role was stripped away piece by piece. First their power, then their independence, then their thrones, then their homeland, and finally even the certainty that they would be buried in their own soil. It is a story about a boy emperor who became a painter in Algeria, and a teenage rebel who died in an African plane crash fighting for the empire that exiled him. It is about an empress who was promised love and monogamy and died alone and forgotten in a French village. It is about a crown prince who guarded the relics of a kingdom he was never allowed to rule, feuding with his own father over a sword. And it is about a last emperor who was worshipped as a god, mocked as a playboy, deposed by his own protege, and buried under a plain black stone in Paris. A man who outlived his empire by half a century and spent all 50 of those years watching his homeland burn from the outside. The Nguyễn dynasty didn't just lose an empire, they lost their country, their purpose, their fortunes, and even the graves of their ancestors. And yet, the bloodline survived. Descendants of the Sons of Heaven are alive today, living quiet, ordinary lives in France, in America, in Vietnam itself. They carry a surname that once meant absolute power over an entire nation, and for most of them, it now means almost nothing at all. Just a curious story to tell, a faded photograph, a link to a world that no longer exists. And when you compare it to the other great falls of the modern age, the Vietnamese story stands strangely alone. The Russian Romanovs were murdered in a cellar, wiped out in a single night of violence. The Ottoman dynasty was expelled en masse and left to starve in European exile. The Austrian Habsburgs lost their empire but held on to some of their wealth and prestige. The Nguyen suffered something different, something slower and almost more cruel. Not a single execution or a mass expulsion, but a 60-year dismemberment, an empire and a family taken apart, one emperor, one exile, one broken promise, one plain grave at a time, until all that remained of the Dragon Throne of Vietnam was a golden seal in a museum case, and a scattering of ordinary people who happened to descend from gods. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel grow and lets me keep making these deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. And drop a comment below and let me know what you think. If that plane hadn't crashed in 1945 and the exiled Emperor Duy Tân had been restored to the throne, could Vietnam's monarchy have survived? Could a dragon throne have changed everything that came after? I'll see you in the next one.